On this mighty tide, the black ships laden with fresh-scented fir planks, rounded sacks of oil bearing seed, or with the dark glitter of coal, are borne along to the town of St. Ogg's. The aged, fluted red roofs and the broad gables of its wharves between the low wooded hill and the river brink, remnants of last year's golden clusters of beehive ricks, rise at intervals beyond the hedgerows. And everywhere, the hedgerows are studded with trees. Just by the red-roofed town of St. Ogg's, the tributary, Ripple, flows with a lively current into the Floss. How lovely the little river is, with its dark, changing wavelets. It seems to me like a living companion while I wander along the bank and listen to its low, placid voice. The clouds are threatening, and it is far on in the afternoon, but I will stand a minute or two on the bridge, for this is Dorlcote Mill, and even in this leafless time of departing February, it is pleasant to look at. The chill, damp season adds charm to the trimly kept, comfortable dwelling house, as old as the elms and the chestnuts that shelter it from the northern blast. The stream is brimful now, half drowning the grassy fringe of the croft in front of the house. The rush of water and the booming of the mill bring a dreamy deafness which heightens the peacefulness of the scene. The great curtain of sound, shutting one out from the world beyond. I watch the unresting wheel sending out its diamond jets of water.
Tom's coming home, Yap. I'm so excited to see him, and I know you are too. Yes, you are. Come here.
A little girl is watching. She's been standing on just the same spot at the edge of the water ever since I paused on the bridge. This is Maggie Tulliver. She lives here at Dorlcote Mill with her mother, father, and brother Tom, who will soon be returning from school. Maggie's mother knocks sharply on the window and beckons her young daughter to come inside.
Up and down by the water like a wild thing. She'll tumble in one day, and then she'll be sorry she didn't listen to her mother. Very sorry.
Mrs. Tulliver, an attractive, blonde, comely woman nearing 40 and wearing a fan-shaped cap, returned to her sewing by the bright fire. Mr. Tulliver, her husband, had been talking about future of Tom's schooling. He felt it important that Tom should have a good education, and even though he was proud that the mill had been in his family for generations, Mr. Tulliver had other ambitions and ulterior motives for him getting an education.
I should like Tom to be a bit of a scholard, so as he might be up to the tricks of these fellas as talk fine and write with a flourish. It'd be a help to me with these lawsuits and arbitrations and things. I wouldn't make a downright lawyer of a lad. I should be very sorry for him to be a rascal like Wakeham, but a sort of engineer or a surveyor or auctioneer.
Mr. Wakeham was a successful lawyer from St. Ogg's, whom 8 years ago won a lawsuit over Mr. Tulliver regarding land rights. And Mr. Tulliver has been going on about it ever since. He had a low opinion of most lawyers, but he believed Wakeham to be the greatest rascal of them all.
Of course, you know best. I've no objections. But hadn't I better kill a couple of fowl and have the aunts and uncles to dinner next week, so as you may hear what Sister Glegg and Sister Pullet have got to say about it?
You may kill every fowl in the yard if you like, Bessie, but I shall ask neither aunt nor uncle what I'm to do with my own lad.
Mr. Tulliver was annoyed by his wife's insistence of involving her outspoken Dodson sisters on every matter concerning his family. And there was no secret of the Dodson sisters' disdain and Mr. Tulliver's constant legal dispute with the neighbouring farmers or millers. It was agreed by all the sisters, but always in Mrs. Tulliver's absence, that the Tulliver blood did not mix well with the Dodson blood, and that, in fact, poor Bessie's children were Tullivers, and that Tom, notwithstanding he had the Dodson complexion, was as likely to be as contrary as his father. Mrs. Tulliver would certainly agree that Maggie was far more like a Tulliver than a Dodson. One of her greatest desires was for her daughter to have a curled crop, like other folks' children. But she had had it cut too short to be pushed behind her ears, and as it was usually straight an hour after it had been taken out of paper, Maggie was incessantly tossing her head to keep her dark, heavy locks out of her gleaming black eyes. An action which gave her very much the air of a small Shetland pony. The next morning, Maggie was heavily disappointed that she had not been allowed to go with her father in the gig to fetch Tom home from school. Her mother insisted it was too wet for a little girl to go out in her best bonnet. Maggie took the opposite view very strongly, and when Mrs. Tulliver was brushing the reluctant crop, Maggie suddenly rushed from under her mother's hands and dipped her head into a basin of water in the vindictive determination that there should be no more curls that day.
Heavens, Maggie! Oh, Maggie! What is to become of you if you are so naughty? Oh, dear, look at your clean pinafore, wet from top to bottom.
Maggie had rushed from the room and had taken refuge in the great attic that ran under the old high-pitched roof. The attic was Maggie's favourite retreat on a wet day. Here she fretted out all her ill humours and talked aloud to the worm-eaten floors and the worm-eaten shelves and the dark rafters festooned with cobwebs. It was here she kept a fetish, the ancient trunk of a large wooden doll which once stared out with the roundest of eyes, above the reddest of cheeks, but now was entirely defaced by a long career of vicarious suffering. Maggie punished the doll for all her misfortunes, driving nails into the head or by beating it against the rough brick of the great chimney, as she did this morning. At last the sobs were getting quieter, and the beating of the doll less fierce, and a sudden beam of sunshine fell through the wire lattice and made Maggie throw down her beaten and battered doll and run to the window. Outside, the granary doors were open, and the little brown and white terrier, Yap, was trotting about in search of a companion. It was irresistible. Maggie tossed her hair back and ran downstairs, seized her bonnet without putting it on, and was quickly out in the yard singing to the little dog. Maggie was content in her surroundings, but eager for Tom's return.
Yep, Tom is coming home, isn't he? Yes.
Through the open doors of the granary, Maggie saw Luke, the head miller, and followed him inside. Maggie loved to linger in the great spaces of the mill, and often came out with her black hair powdered to a soft whiteness that made her dark eyes flash with a new fire.
Yep, I won't be a minute.
The resolute din, the unresting motion of the great stones giving her a dim, delicious awe, as at the presence of an uncontrollable force. The meal forever pouring, the fine white powder softening all surfaces and making the very spider nets look like fairy lacework. The sweet, pure scent of the meal all helped to make Maggie feel that the mill was a little world apart from her outside everyday life. It was early afternoon, and at last the quick, light bowling of the gig wheels could be heard.
There he is, my sweet lad.
Whoa, girl.
You've been sliding down the grade, haven't you, Magsy? It's all in your hair.
Mrs. Tulliver stood with her arms open. Maggie jumped from one leg and then the other, and Tom submitted to be kissed willingly enough, though Maggie hung on his neck in rather a strangling fashion, while his blue-grey eyes wandered towards the croft and the lambs and the river, where he promised himself that he would begin to fish the first thing tomorrow morning. He would take Maggie too, and he presented her with her own fish line when they were sat in the warm parlour later that same day.
You shall catch your own fish, Maggie, and put worms on and everything. Won't it be fun?
Maggie's answer was to throw her arms around Tom's neck and hug him and hold her cheek against his without speaking, while he slowly unwound some of the line, saying, after a pause,
Wasn't I a good brother now, to buy you a line all to yourself?
Yes, very good. I do love you, Tom.
But it was not too long before Tom found something to be angry at his sister about.
I told you to go see the rabbits every day!
Maggie had been left in charge of feeding Tom's rabbits, but she had forgotten about them, and they had all died.
I couldn't help. I forgot. I am so very sorry.
And I'm sorry I bought you the fish line. You shan't go fishing with me tomorrow. I don't love you.
Oh, Please forgive me, Tom. My heart will
These
break.
bitter sorrows of childhood, when sorrow is all new and strange, when hope has not yet got wings to fly beyond the days and weeks, and the space from summer to summer seems measureless. Tom was home, and Maggie had thought how happy she should be, and now he was cruel to her. What was the use of anything if Tom didn't love her? Maggie returned to the attic resolute that she would stay up there all night and starve herself, and then they would be frightened and Tom would be sorry. But then she began to cry again at the idea that they didn't mind her being there.
Why, Tom, where's the little wench?
I don't know.
Tom didn't want to tell of Maggie, though he was very angry with her. He was a lad of honour.
What? And she been playing with you all this while? She'd been thinking of nothing but your coming home.
I haven't seen her this 2 hours.
Goodness heart, she's got drowned.
Nay, she's none drowned. You've been naughty to her, I doubt, Tom.
I'm sure I haven't, Father. I think she's in the house.
Perhaps up in that attic, singing and talking to herself and forgetting all about meal times.
You go and fetch her down, Tom. And be good to her, do you hear? Else I'll let you know better.
Yes, Father.
Mr. Tulliver spoke rather sharply. His fatherly fondness for Maggie made him suspect that the lad had been hard upon the little wench, else she would never have left his side. Tom went out rather sullenly, carrying his piece of plum cake, for although he did not intend to reprieve Maggie of her punishment, which was no more than she deserved, he never disobeyed his father.
Maggie, you're to come down and have your tea.
Oh, Tom, please forgive me. I can't bear it. I'll always be good, always remember things. Do love me. Please, dear Tom.
Don't cry then. Come along, Maxie. And have tea.
So ended the sorrows of the day, and the next morning Maggie was trotting with her own fishing rod in one hand and the handle of a basket in the other, looking radiant from under her beaver bonnet, because Tom was good to her.
Here's a good spot. Come sit next to me, Maxie.
Coming, Tom.
It was one of their happy mornings. They sat down together to fish with no thought that life would ever change much for them. They would only get bigger and not go to school. And it would always be like the holidays. They would always live together and be fond of each other, and the mill with its booming, and the great chestnut tree under which they played at houses, their own little river, the Ripple, where the banks seemed like home, and above all, the great Floss, along which they wandered with a sense of travel. These things would always be just the same to them. Life did change for Tom and Maggie, and yet they were not wrong in believing that the thoughts and loves of these first years would always make part of their lives. We could never have loved the earth so well if we had had no childhood in it. If it were not the earth where the same flowers come up again every spring that we used to gather with our tiny fingers as we sat lisping to ourselves on the grass. It was Easter week, and Mrs. Tulliver's cheesecakes were more exquisitely light than usual, and Kezia, the housemaid, felt proud to live under a mistress who could make such pastry. The aunts and uncles had been invited to the Tulliver house for lunch, so they may hear of Mr. Tulliver's plans to send Tom away to school. And though Tom and Maggie were not particularly looking forward to the visit, there were such various and suggestive baking scents mingled with the aroma of gravy, it was impossible to feel altogether gloomy. And Cousin Lucy was coming, and this delighted Maggie, who adored her little cousin nearly as much as Mrs. Tulliver, who couldn't help loving Lucy, as if she were her own child.
You may set her on a stool and there she'll sit neat as a pin.
Mrs. Clegg, the eldest of the 4 Dodson sisters, sat in Mrs. Tulliver's armchair and, holding her large gold watch in her hand, observed to Mrs. Tulliver that whatever it might be by other people's clocks and watches, it was gone 12:30 by hers.
The dinner won't be ready till 1:30, but if it's too long for you to wait, let me fetch you a cheesecake and a glass of wine.
Well, Bessie, I should have thought you'd know your own sister better. I never did eat between meals, and I'm not going to begin. And I do hope you haven't got a great dinner for us. You've got 2 children to provide for, and your husband spent your fortune going to law, and he's like to spend his own too.
Mr. Tulliver says he always will have a good dinner for his family while he can pay for it. And he's a right to do as he likes in his own house, sister.
The sound of wheels on the path outside was an interruption highly welcome to Mrs. Tulliver, who hastened out to receive the favourite of all her sisters, Mrs. Pullet.
Welcome, sister.
The Dodsons were certainly a very well-respected family indeed.
Sister Glegg is here already.
As much looked up to as any in their parish, or the next to it. And no one was surprised the 2 eldest had married so well.
Wait a moment, Lucy, while I adjust your curls.
Mrs. Dean and little cousin Lucy appeared soon after Mrs. Pullet, and Mrs. Tulliver looked on with a silent pang while Lucy's blonde curls were adjusted. It was quite unaccountable that Mrs. Dean, the thinnest and sallowest of all the Miss Dodsons, should have had this child, who might have been taken for Mrs. Tulliver's any day.
Maggie, go and get your hair brushed. Do for shame.
Yes, Mother.
Maggie.
Maggie pulled Tom's sleeve as she passed. There was something she wanted to do before dinner. Tom followed Maggie into her mother's bedroom and saw her go at once to a drawer from which she took a large pair of scissors.
What are they for, Maggie?
Maggie answered by seizing her front locks and cutting them straight across the middle of her forehead.
Oh, my buttons, Maggie! You'll catch it! You better not cut any more off.
Snip went the great scissors again while Tom was speaking, and he couldn't help feeling it was rather good fun.
Here, Tom, cut it behind for me.
The black locks were so thick nothing could be more tempting to a lad. One delicious grinding snip, and then another, and the hinder locks fell heavily on the floor.
Oh, my buttons!
When Tom laughed at her, Maggie felt an unexpected pang. Her flushed cheeks began to pale, and her lips to tremble a little. Tom hurried downstairs, tempted by the delicious smells of the dinner. When Maggie eventually joined him, the shrieks and hysteria from her mother and her aunts confirmed to Maggie how very foolish she had been. She ran to her father, hid her face on his shoulder, and burst into loud sobbing.
Come, my little wench, never mind. You was in the right to cut it off if it plagued you. Give over your crying. Father will take your part.
While the children played outside, Mrs. Tulliver thought it was the right moment to communicate Mr. Tulliver's intention concerning Tom.
I want to give him an education, as he'll be even with the lawyers and folks, and put me up to a notion now and then.
Mrs. Clegg responded with a long, guttural sound with closed lips that smiled in mingled pity and scorn.
It'd be a fine deal better for some people if they'd let the lawyers alone.
The conversation about Tom's schooling continued, and Aunt Clegg continued to make her feelings on the matter very clear.
Don't trouble yourself with me. I can take care of my own affairs.
Maybe I won't go to the trouble of lending money in the future.
Sister, drink your wine.
You needn't worry. You'll get your damn money back, woman.
Well, I'm not going to stay a minute longer.
The disagreement between Mr. Tulliver and Mrs. Clegg continued, and despite the pleading of Mrs. Tulliver, Mrs. Clegg refused to stay a minute longer and left in a fury, doubting she would ever see her money again. The next day, Mr. Tulliver was on horseback on his way to Basset to see his sister and her husband, Mr. Moss. For having made up his mind that he would pay back Mrs. Clegg her loan of £500, it naturally occurred to him that he had a promissory note for £300 lent to his brother-in-law, Moss.
Oh, brother, I'm glad to see you. I didn't look for you today. How'd you do?
Oh, pretty well, Mrs. Moss, pretty well.
She knew at once that her brother was not in good humour. He never called her Mrs. Moss, except when he was angry and when they were in company.
Your husband in the house, I suppose? I have some business to discuss with him.
He's only in the potato fields yonders. Georgie'll fetch him. Come inside and wait.
Mr. Tulliver declined this offer and looked into the distance. But his manner started to soften and his eyes got milder when his sister asked of Mrs. Tulliver and the children.
I wish you'd let the children come see their cousin some day. My little uns want to see their cousin Maggie, so as never was.
She's fonder of you than of the other aunts, I think. She takes after our family, not a bit of her mother's in her. She's a picture of you.
I hope your boy will always be good to his sister, though there's but 2 of them, like you and me, brother.
That arrow went straight to Mr. Tulliver's heart. He had not a rapid imagination, but the thought of Maggie was very near to him, And he was not long seeing his relation to his own sister side by side with Tom's relation to Maggie. Despite his wish to get into a quarrel with Mr. Moss, who admitted that he was behind with the interest but had been so unlucky with his crop last year, Mr. Tulliver reassured his weeping sister before he left that he would shift without the money a bit. Her tears came again at this unexpected kindness, and she could say nothing.
Come. The little wench shall come and see you. I'll bring her and Tom some day before he goes to school. You mustn't fret. I'll always be a good brother to you.
And so the respectable miller returned along the Bassett lanes, rather more puzzled than before as to ways and means, but still with a sense of danger escaped. He had come across his mind that if he were hard upon his sister, it might somehow tend to make Tom hard upon Maggie at some distant day, when her father was no longer there to take her part. While the troubles of Maggie's future were on her father's mind, it was decided by Mrs. Tulliver that building card houses was a suitable amusement for boys and girls in their best clothes. And though Tom deduced that no girls could ever make anything, it happened that Lucy proved wonderfully clever at building, while Maggie's houses fell, and Tom told her she was a stupid.
I'm not a stupid. I know a great many things you don't. Oh, dare I say, Miss Spitfire? I'd never be such a cross thing as you. I like Lucy better than you. I wish Lucy was my sister.
Maggie told Tom he was wicked and cruel, and started hurriedly up from her place on the floor, and in doing so, upset Tom's wonderful card pagoda. She really did not mean it, but the circumstantial evidence was against her, and Tom turned white with anger. Maggie stood in dismay and terror, while Lucy looked on mutely, like a kitten, pausing from its lapping. A little while later, the children and Mrs. Tulliver were on their way to Garum Firs, Uncle and Aunt Pullett's home. Tom's persistent coldness to Maggie on their walk spoiled the fresh air and the sunshine.
Lucy.
Tom called to Lucy to look at the half-built bird's nest, without caring to show it to Maggie. Lucy had said,
Maggie, wouldn't you like to come and see?
but Tom was deaf.
Look at the peacock spreading his tail.
I adore the bantams all speckled and top-knotted.
Look, Maggie, at the silly Friesland hens with their feathers all turned the wrong way.
Still, the sight of the peacock opportunely spreading its tail on the stackyard wall, just as they reached Garum Firs, was enough to divert the mind temporarily from personal grievances. Aunt Pullet appeared at the doorway, and as soon as her sister was within hearing, said,
Stop the children, for God's sake, Bessie. Don't let them come at the doorsteps. Sally's bringing the old mat and the duster to rub their shoes.
Mrs. Pullet's front door mats were by no means intended to wipe shoes on. The very scraper had a deputy to do its dirty work. After tea and cakes, the children followed the garden path to the pond.
Oh, there's such a big funny toad, Maggie. Do come and see.
Maggie said nothing, but turned away from her with a deeper frown. Maggie would have thought that she could never be cross with pretty little Lucy, but she was beginning to think that she should like to make Lucy cry.
I didn't know they could swim.
Maggie had drawn nearer. She must see it too.
Now get away, Maggie. There's no room for you on the grass here. Nobody asked you to come.
And with a fierce thrust of her small arm, Maggie pushed poor little Lucy into the cow-trodden mud. Tom could not restrain himself and gave Maggie 2 smart slaps on the arm as he ran to pick up Lucy, who lay crying helplessly, and Maggie retreated to the roots of a tree a few yards off and looked on impenitently.
I shall tell Mother you know, Miss Mag.
It was not Tom's practice to tell,
It's all right.
but here justice clearly demanded that Maggie should be punished.
Well, your husband is awkward, you know, Bessie.
While the sisters were talking, they were suddenly interrupted by Sally, the housemaid, who presented Lucy at the parlour door.
Oh, good gracious. Oh, keep her at the door, Sally. Don't bring her off the oilcloth, whatever you do.
If you please, it was Miss Maggie has pushed her in. Master Tom said so.
There it is, Bessie. It's what I've been telling you. It's your children. There's no knowing what they'll come to.
While Mrs. Pullet began to give elaborate directions to Sally how to guard the premises from serious injury in the course of removing the dirt, Mrs. Tulliver spoke to Tom.
Tom, you naughty boy, where's your sister?
I don't know.
Why, where did you leave her?
Sitting under a tree by the pond.
Go and fetch her in this minute.
Yes, Mother.
The idea of Maggie sitting alone by the pond roused an habitual fear in Mrs. Tulliver's mind. There was a terrified search for Maggie, and it took some time convincing her mother that she was not in the pond. After a while, Tom started with the idea that Maggie was gone home, and the suggestion was seized as a comfort by his mother. What the father would say if Maggie was lost was a question that predominated over everything. Left alone, Maggie had decided that she would run away to the gypsies.
My little lady, where are you off to?
Not any further. I'm come to stay with you, please.
That's pretty. Come then. Why, what a nice little lady you are, to be sure.
It was delightful, and just what Maggie had expected. The gypsies saw at once that she was a little lady and were prepared to treat her accordingly. The gypsy took Maggie by the hand, and she thought her very agreeable, but wished she had not been so dirty.
It's getting darker. I think I must go home now. And I'll come again another day. Then I can bring you a basket of some jam tarts and things.
One of the younger men in the group set her on the donkey. She felt relieved, but she had only a trembling hope that she was really going home. The red light of the setting sun seemed to have a portentous meaning, but at last, oh, sight of joy, the lane they were riding on was coming to an end, and there was a broad, high road and a finger post, which she had seen before, surely, that read, 2 cent ogs, 2 miles. The gypsy really meant to take her home. And then Maggie caught sight of someone coming on a white-faced horse.
Oh, stop! Stop! Stop, there's my father! Oh, father! Father!
Mr. Tulliver gave the gypsy a 5-shilling note.
Very kind.
On the way home, Maggie told Mr. Tulliver that she had run away because Tom was so angry with her, and she was so unhappy, while Mr. Tulliver soothed her and told her,
You mustn't think of running away from Father. What'll Father do without his little wench?
Mr. Tulliver spoke very strongly when he reached home that evening, and the effect was seen in the remarkable fact that Maggie never heard one reproach from her mother or one taunt from Tom about this foolish business of her running away to the gypsies, and Maggie was rather awe-stricken by this unusual treatment. As the warm weather gave way to the crisp chill of autumn, it was time for Tom to go to school.
Now, Tulliver.
Tom's sufferings during the first quarter he was at King's Lorton, under the distinguished care of the Reverend Walter Stelling, were rather severe. He had not been at King's Lorton a fortnight before it was evident to him that life, complicated not only with the Latin grammar, but with a new standard of English pronunciation, was a very difficult, solitary business. But it was impossible for Tom to dislike his teacher, Mr. Stelling, who was a well-sized, broad-chested man, not yet 30, with large, lightish grey eyes that were always open. But oh, how Tom longed for a playfellow. In his secret heart, he yearned to have Maggie with him, and was almost ready to dote on her exasperating acts of forgetfulness. Though, when he was at home, he always represented it as a great favour on his part to let Maggie trot by his side on his pleasure excursions. But before this dreary half-year was ended, Maggie actually came. Mrs. Stelling had given a general invitation for the little girl to come and stay with her brother, so when Mr. Tulliver drove to King's Lorton in October, Maggie came too, with the sense that she was taking a great journey and beginning to see the world.
Well, my lad, you look rarely. School agrees with you.
I don't think I am well, Father. I wish you'd asked Mr. Stelling not to let me do Euclid. It brings on the toothache.
Go, you must learn what your master tells you. He knows what's right.
I'll help you now, Tom.
You help me? You silly thing. I should like to see you doing one of my lessons.
Well done, little un. Come, let's get you inside.
Tom was very glad to have dear old Maggie with him to dispute and crow over again.
This is the study, Maxie. Right,
and Maggie was allowed to be in the study while Tom had his lessons. It was a very happy fortnight for Maggie and Tom. When she left, Tom missed her grievously. He had really been brighter and had got through his lessons better since she had been there. But eventually, the dreary half-year did come to an end. Christmas was cheery, but not so for Mr. Tulliver. He was irate and defiant. The particular embodiment of the evil principle now exciting Mr. Tulliver's determined resistance was Mr. Pivot, who, having lands higher up the Ripple, was taking measures for their irrigation, which either were, or would be, or were bound to be, on the principle that water was water, an infringement on Mr. Tulliver's legitimate share of water power. He had no male audience today except Mr. Moss, who, along with Mrs. Moss and their 8 children, had come to spend Christmas with the Tullivers. Mr. Moss confessed to knowing nothing of the nature of mills, but Mrs. Moss was quite anxious for her brother.
You won't be forced to go to law with him, I hope, brother.
I don't know what I shall be forced to do, but I know what I shall force him to with his dikes and irrigations, if there's any law to be brought to bear on the right side.
I hope and pray he won't go to the law, for there's never knowing where that might end. And the right doesn't always win. This Mr. Pivot's a rich man, by what I can make out, and the rich mostly get things their own way.
And I know well enough who's at the bottom of it. He's got Wakeham to back him and egg him on.
Father, Uncle Clegg says Lawyer Wakeham is sending his son to Mr. Stelling.
Is that right? Well, don't learn anything bad of him, that's all. Though he takes after his mother in the face, there ain't much of his father in him. And it's a sign Wakeham thinks high of Mr. Stelling, though he is still a rascal.
It was a cold, wet January day when Tom went back to school.
Well, Tulliver, we're glad to see you again. Well, take off your wrappings and come into the study till dinner. You'll find a bright fire there and a new companion.
Tom felt an uncomfortable flutter as he took off his woolen comforter and other wrappings. He had seen Philip Wakeham at St. Ogg's, but had always turned his eyes away from him as quickly as possible. Tom looked confused and awkward while Philip rose and glanced at him timidly.
I shall leave you to make acquaintance by yourselves.
Mr. Stelling wisely turned away and closed the door behind him. Boys' shyness only wears off in the absence of their elders. Philip was at once too proud and too timid to walk towards Tom. He thought, or rather felt, that Tom had an aversion to looking at him. Everyone almost disliked looking at him, and his deformity was more conspicuous when he walked. Tom began to look oftener and longer at Philip's face, for he could see it without noticing the hump, and it was really not a disagreeable face. Very old-looking for a boy who was 15, just 2 years older than Tom. Philip Wakeham was a pale, puny fellow, and it was quite clear he would not be able to play at anything worth speaking of, but he handled his pencil in an enviable manner.
Oh, my buttons! I wish I could draw like that. I'm to learn drawing this half. I wonder if I shall learn to make dogs and donkeys like you.
Tom was amazed that Philip had never had drawing lessons and was impressed by his talents and his pictures. But Tom never quite lost the feeling that Philip, being the son of a rascal, was his natural enemy, and never thoroughly overcame his repulsion to Philip's deformity. When Maggie came for her second visit, however, she could not help looking with growing interest at the new schoolfellow, although he was the son of that wicked Lawyer Wakeham who made her father so angry.
I think Philip Wakeham seems a nice boy, Tom. He couldn't choose his father, you know. And I've read of very bad men who had good sons as well as good parents who have bad children. And if Philip is good, I think we ought to be more sorry for him because his father is not a good man. You like him, don't you?
Oh, he's a strange fellow. And he is sulky as can be with me, because I told him his father was a rogue.
Tom is forced to rest after an ill-thought-out prank with a sword injuring his foot. Philip spends all his out-of-school hours with Maggie and Tom. Philip knew a great deal of fighting stories, and Tom liked to hear them. He preferred them to Maggie's stupid girl stories, and during this time, Tom thought that Wakeham's son did not seem so spiteful a fellow as he at first expected. One afternoon, Maggie and Philip were in the study alone together, while Tom's injured foot was being dressed.
Maggie, if you had a brother like me, do you think you should have loved him as well as Tom?
Oh, yes. Better. No, not better. because I don't think I could love you better than Tom. But I should be so sorry. So sorry for you.
Philip winced under her pity. This is not what he had meant. Maggie, young as she was, felt her mistake and added quickly.
But you are so very clever, Philip, and you can play and sing. I wish you were my brother. I'm very fond of you. And you would stay at home with me when Tom went out, and you would teach me everything, wouldn't you?
But you'll go away soon and go to school, Maggie. And then I shall see you when you're grown up, and you'll hardly take any notice of me.
I won't forget you, Philip. I never forget anyone.
And I shall never forget you. I'm very fond of you, Maggie. And when I'm unhappy, I shall think of you. I wish I had a sister with dark eyes just like yours.
Why do you like my eyes?
I don't know. They're not like any other eyes. They seem to be trying to speak kindly.
Maggie wanted Tom to be friends with Philip while he remained at school, and spoke of him warmly to Mr. Tulliver when he came to collect her. But Mr. Tulliver was not keen for Tom to become close friends with Philip, and when Maggie was gone, the friendly warmth that had been kindled by pity and gratitude died out by degrees and left them in their old relation to each other. If boys and men are to be welded together in the glow of transient feeling, they must be made of metal that will mix. Else they will inevitably fall asunder when the heat dies out. 2 years had passed, and Tom went on to the 5th half year till he was turned 16 at King's Lorton. While Maggie was growing, with a rapidity which her aunts considered highly reprehensible, at Miss Furness's boarding school in the ancient town of Latham on the Floss, with cousin Lucy for her companion. In her early letters to Tom, she had always sent her love to Philip. She was pained to hear Tom say, in the holidays, that Philip was as often cross, and they were no longer very good friends. She hardly ever saw Philip during the remainder of their school life. In the midsummer holidays, he was always away at the seaside.
Don't mention his name near me, the insufferable rascal. He means to ruin me.
When their father was actually engaged in the long-threatened lawsuit, and Wakeham, as the agent of both Pivot and Old Harry, was acting against him, even Maggie felt with some sadness that they were not likely ever to have any intimacy with Philip again. The very name of Wakeham made her father angry, and she had once heard him say that if that crook-backed son lived to inherit his father's ill-gotten gains, there would be a curse upon him.
Have as little to do with him at school as you can, my lad.
By the time Tom had reached his last quarter at King's Lorton, the years had made striking changes in him.
You've made great progress here, Tulliver.
Thank you, sir.
He was a tall youth now, carrying himself without the least awkwardness, and speaking without more shyness than was a becoming symptom of blended diffidence and pride. Philip had already left, at the autumn quarter, that he might go south for the winter for the sake of his health, and this change helped to give Tom the unsettled, exulting feeling that usually belongs to the last months before leaving school. Tom had not heard anything from home for some weeks, when to his great surprise, on the morning of a dark, cold day near the end of November, he was told that his sister was in the drawing room. Maggie, too, was tall now, with braided and coiled hair.
How is it you come so early this cold morning, Maggie? And why are you not at school?
Father wanted me home. I came home 3 or 4 days ago.
Isn't my father well?
Not quite. He's very unhappy, Tom.
My father hasn't lost.
Oh, Tom. He will lose the mill, and the land, and everything. He will have nothing left.
Anxiety about the future had never entered Tom's mind. He had never dreamed that his father would fail.
Dear, dear Tom. Don't fret too much. Try and bear it well.
I shall go home with you, Maggie. Didn't my father say I was to go?
No, Tom, Father didn't wish it. But Mother wants you to come. Poor Mother. She cries so. Oh, Tom, it's very dreadful at home. Poor Father.
Where is my father? Tell me, Maggie.
He is at home, but he is not himself. He fell off his horse.
What?
He has known nobody but me ever since. He seems to have lost his senses. Oh, Father. Father.
With these last words, Maggie's sobs burst forth with the more violence for the previous struggle against them. Tom felt the pressure of the heart which forbids tears. He had no distinct vision of their troubles, as Maggie had, who had been at home. He only felt the crushing weight of what seemed unmitigated misfortune.
Wishing her father a speedy recovery. God bless you, my boy.
Take care. Bless you. Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Stelling.
Tom had so often thought how joyful he should be the day he left school for good. And now his school years seemed like a holiday that had come to an end. Mr. and Mrs. Stelling watched as the two slight youthful figures grew indistinct on the distant road and were soon lost behind the hedgerow. They had gone forth together into their new life of sorrow, and they would never more see the sunshine undimmed by remembered cares. They had entered the thorny wilderness, and the golden gates of their childhood had forever closed behind them. When the coach set down Tom and Maggie, it was 5 hours since they started for home, and Maggie was thinking with some trembling that her father had perhaps missed her and asked for the little wench in vain. The parlour door was ajar, and there was a strong smell of tobacco. There was a coarse, dingy man of whose face Tom had some vague recollection, sitting in his father's chair.
Who can it be, Tom?
The truth flashed on Tom's mind in an instant. To have the bailiff in the house and to be sold up were phrases which he had been used to, even as a little boy. They were part of the disgrace and misery of failing. But Maggie had not understood the appearance of this stranger, but was worried that it might have something to do with a change in her father. So she rushed upstairs to check for herself, and Tom, ignoring the bailiff, followed behind. All was silent in there. Her father was lying, heedless of everything around him, with his eyes closed as she had left him. A servant was there, but not her mother.
Father's lying quiet, Tom. Let us go look for Mother.
She's not downstairs, nor in the bedrooms.
I wonder where she is.
There was but one room below the attic which was unsearched. It was the storeroom, where her mother kept all her linen and all the precious best things that were only unwrapped and brought out on special occasions. Tom opened the door of this room, and Mrs. Tulliver was seated there with all her laid-up treasures. One of the linen chests was open, the silver teapot was unwrapped from its many folds of paper, and the best china was laid out on top of the closed linen chest. Spoons and skewers and ladles were spread in rows on the shelves, and the poor woman was shaking her head and weeping with a bitter tension of the mouth over the mark Elizabeth Dodson on the corner of some tablecloths she had held in her lap.
Mother?
Oh, my boy, my boy. To think as I should live to see this day. We are ruined. Everything's going to be sold up. To think your feather should have married me to bring me to this. Oh, we've got nothing. We shall be beggars. We must go to the workhouse. And I did say to him time and times, whatever you do, don't go to law. And what more could I do? I've had to sit by while my own fortune's been spent, and what should have been my children's too. You'll have never a penny, my boy, but it isn't your mother's fault.
She put out one arm towards Tom, looking at him piteously with her helpless, childish blue eyes. The poor lad went to her and kissed her, and she clung to him. And the natural strength and firmness of his nature was beginning to assert itself. He must now behave like a man and take care of his mother.
Don't fret, Mother. I shall soon be able to get money. I'll get a situation of some sort.
Oh, bless you, my boy. but I shouldn't have minded so much if we could have kept the things with my name on them.
Mother, how can you talk so? As if you cared only for things with your name on it, and not for what is my father's name too. And to care about anything but dear father himself, when he's lying there and he may never speak to us again. Tom, you ought to say so too. You ought not to let anyone find fault with my father.
Choked with mingled grief and anger, Maggie left the room and took her old place on her father's bed. Her heart went out to him with a stronger movement than ever at the thought that people would blame him. Tom was a little shocked at Maggie's outburst, telling him as well as his mother what it was right to do. She ought to have learnt better by this time. But he presently went into his father's room, and the sight there touched him in a way that affected the slighter impressions of the previous hour. When Maggie saw how he was moved, she went to him and put her arm around his neck as he sat by the bed, and the two of them forgot everything else in that sense that they had one father and one sorrow. It was at 11 o'clock the next morning that the aunts and uncles came to hold their consultation.
And how is the old man upstairs?
Dr. Turnbull thought him a deal better this morning. He took more notice and spoke to me.
The sisters continued to quarrel among each other, Mrs. Pullet reprimanding the eldest, Mrs. Clegg, for not visiting before today, but Mrs. Tulliver's main concern was keeping her best things within the family and not to be sold at auction where, as Uncle Pullet remarked, they may go for an old song.
Oh dear. To think of my chain being sold. And I bought it when I was married, just as you did yours, Jane and Sophie. I wish it could be managed so as my teapot and chainy and the best casters needn't be put up for sale. And the sugar tongs. First things I ever bought.
You must bring your mind to your circumstances, Bessie, and not be thinking of silver and chainy, but whether you should get so much as a flock bed to lie on, and a blanket to cover you, and a stool to sit on. The disgrace of the family can't be helped with buying teapots. The disgrace is for one of the family to have married a man that has brought her to beggary.
Maggie had started up from the sofa at the allusion of her father, but Tom saw her action and flushed face in time to prevent her from speaking.
Be quiet, Maggie.
Tom was firm with Maggie and pushed her aside. It was a remarkable manifestation of self-command and practical judgment in a lad of 16 that when his aunt Clegg ceased, he began to speak in a quiet and respectful manner, though with a good deal of trembling in his voice.
Then, Aunt, if you think it's a disgrace to the family that we should be sold up, wouldn't it be better to prevent it altogether? And if you and my Aunt Pullet think of leaving any money to me and Maggie, wouldn't it be better to give it now and pay the debt we're going to be sold up for, and save my mother from parting with her furniture?
There was silence for a few moments, for everyone, including Maggie, was astonished at Tom's sudden manliness of tone. Uncle Clegg was the first to speak.
Aye, young man. Come now. You show some notion of things. But there's the interest you must remember. Your aunts get 5% on their money, and they'd lost that if they advanced it. Eh? You haven't thought of that.
I could work and pay that every year. I'd do anything to save my mother from parting with her things.
Well done.
Uncle Clegg had been drawing Tom out, rather than reflecting on the practicability of his proposal, and he admired his nephew's newfound confidence. But he had produced the unfortunate result of irritating his wife.
Yes, Mr. Clegg. It's pleasant work for you to be giving my money away, as you've pretended to leave at my own disposal. And my money, as was my own father's gift, and not yours, Mr. Clegg. And I've saved it and added to it myself, and I've more to put out welly every year. And it's to go and be sunk in other folks' furniture and encourage them in luxury as they've no means of supporting.
Why do you come then? Talking and interfering with us and scolding us. If you don't mean to do anything to help my poor mother, your own sister, if you've no feeling for her when she's in trouble and won't part with anything, though you would never miss it, to save her from pain,
Tom and I don't ever want to have any of your money if you won't help my mother. We'd rather not have it. We'll do without you.
Having hurled her defiance at the aunts and uncles in this way, Maggie stood still with her large, dark eyes glaring at them, as if she were ready to await all consequences. Mrs. Tulliver was frightened. There was something portentous in this mad outbreak. She did not see how life could go on after it. Tom was vexed. It was no use to talk so, while the aunts were shocked with surprise.
You haven't seen the end of your trouble with that child, Bessie.
Oh, it's no more than what I always said. Oh, there isn't a bit of our family in her.
Mr. Clegg insisted they waste no more time in talking. They needed to go to business. He told Tom to get a pen and paper so they could start to make an inventory of household items. And while Mr. Clegg was speaking, a tall, dark figure hurried past the window. The tall, dark-haired woman was a strong contrast to the Dodson sisters as she entered in her shabby dress, with her shawl and bonnet looking as if they had been hastily huddled on.
Oh, my dears, you've no call to think well of me. I'm a poor aunt to you, for I'm one of them as take and give nothing. How is my poor brother?
Dr. Turnbull thinks he'll get better. Sit down, Aunt Gritty, don't fret.
Oh, my sweet child, I feel torn in two.
Mrs. Moss allowed Maggie to lead her to the sofa, but still did not seem to notice the presence of the rest.
We've £300 of my brother's money, and now he wants it, and you all want it, poor things. And yet we must be sold up to pay it, and there's my poor children, 8 of them. And I feel as if I were a robber, but I'm sure I'd no thought as my brother.
The poor woman was interrupted by a rising sob. Mrs. Tulliver had not known that the sum that her husband had lent to his sister was quite so much.
£300? Oh dear, oh dear.
What madness to lend money without security.
There was security. My husband gave a note for it. We're not that sort of people. Neither of us, as had robbed my brother's children. And we'd look to paying back the money when the times got a bit better.
Well, but now, hasn't your husband no way of raising this money? Because it'd be a little fortune, like, for these folks if we can do without Tulliver's being made bankrupt. Your husband's got stock. It is but right that, you know, he should raise the money.
Oh, sir, you don't know what bad luck my husband's had with his stock. The farm is suffering so as never was for want of stock, and we've sold all the wheat, and we're behind with our rent.
Don't cry so, Aunt. Oh, don't fret.
Uncle Clegg warned Mrs. Moss that if Mr. Tulliver's made bankrupt and he has a note of hand from her husband for £300, they will have to pay it.
And if he isn't made bankrupt, as I said before, £300 will be a little fortune for him, poor man. We don't know, but he may be partly helpless, if he ever gets up again. Oh, I'm very sorry if it goes hard with you, Mrs. Moss, but my opinion is, looking at it one way, it'll be right for you to raise the money. And looking at it t'other way, you'll be obliged to pay it. You won't think me ill of speaking the truth.
Uncle, I don't think it would be right for my Aunt Moss to pay the money if it would be against my father's will for her to pay it.
Why, no, perhaps not, Tom. But then he'd have destroyed the note, you know. We must look for the note. What makes you think it'd be against his will?
Father told me before I went to school. He said, I've always been good to my sister, though she married against my will, and I've lent Moss money, but I shall never think of distressing him to pay it. I'd rather lose it. My children must not mind being poorer for that. And now my father's ill and not able to speak for himself. I shouldn't like anything to be done contrary to what he said to me.
Tom believed the note from Mr. Moss regarding the loan of £300 would be found and destroyed. This would be the only way to make it safe for Mr. and Mrs. Moss should Mr. Tulliver face bankruptcy.
You'll never be the poorer for this, my dear boy, if there's a God above. And if the money's wanted for your father, Moss and me'll pay it. The same as if there was ever such security. We'll do as we'd be done by. For if my children have got no other luck, They've got an honest father and mother.
Even Mrs. Glegg could not withhold her approval from Tom's words that morning. She felt that the Dodson blood was certainly speaking in him, though if his father had been a Dodson, there would never have been this wicked alienation of money. The next day at 10 o'clock, Tom was on his way to St. Ogg's to see his Uncle Dean. Tom had made up his mind that his Uncle Dean was the right person to ask about getting some employment. By the time Tom was entering St. Ogg's, he was thinking that he would buy his father's mill and land again when he was rich enough and improve the house and live there.
Nothing fresh the matter at home, I hope, Tom? How's your father?
Oh, much the same, thank you, Uncle.
Sit down, my boy.
Thank you, Uncle.
Now, let me hear what you have to say.
I want to get a situation, Uncle, so that I may earn some money.
Tom continued, telling his uncle of his desire to enter into some business where he could get on. However, Mr. Dean thought Tom was too young to be put into a situation that would earn him money quickly, and when Tom left his uncle and went out into the cold, damp air, he formed no visions of the distant future. He only felt the present was very hard. Later that day, Maggie wanted to know how he'd got on with his Uncle Dean.
Did he say he would give you a situation?
Go away, Maggie.
You are always so harsh to me, Tom.
No, I'm not harsh. I'm always kind to you, and so I shall be. I shall always take care of you. But you must mind what I say.
Maggie rushed away. That burst of tears, which she felt must come, might not happen till she was safe upstairs. They were very bitter tears. Everybody in the world seemed so hard and unkind to Maggie. In that dark time in December, the sale of the household furniture lasted 2 days. Mr. Tulliver lay in a state of living death throughout the critical hours when the noise of the sale came nearest to his chamber. But at last it was over. Mrs. Tulliver's blonde face seemed aged 10 years by the last 30 hours. The days passed, and Mr. Tulliver showed, at least to the eyes of the medical man, stronger and stronger symptoms of a gradual return to his normal condition. By the second week in January, the bills were out advertising the sale of Mr. Tulliver's farming and other stock, to be followed by a sale of the mill and land. Uncle Dean, as well as finding Tom's situation, had also taken an interest in Tulliver's business affairs. It would not be a bad speculation for Guest & Co. to buy Dorlcote Mill and carry on the business, thus keeping the mill in the Tulliver name. However, the fact that Wakeham held the mortgage on the land might put it into his head to bid for the whole estate, and Mr. Dean felt obliged to tell Mrs. Tulliver this. Mrs. Tulliver thought it would be a better result for her and her family if Guest & Co. buy the mill. But nobody, it appeared, had thought of going to speak to Wakeham on this business, so Mrs. Tulliver decided to take matters into her own hands.
Pray be seated, Mrs. Tulliver.
Mrs. Tulliver was beginning to feel alarmed at her own courage, now she was really in the presence of the formidable man. She asked Wakeham outright not to buy the mill, for it would be such a thing for her husband to stay where he is. When Mr. Wakeham suggested that he bought the mill and had Mr. Tulliver act as his manager, Mrs. Tulliver replied,
"Oh, sir, I doubt he could never be got to do it. Not if the very mill stood still to beg and pray of him, for your name's like poison to him."
When Wakeham had entered his office that morning, he had had no intention of purchasing Dorlcote Mill. But now his mind was already made up. It would be a pleasure to do the very thing that would cause Mr. Tulliver the most deadly mortification.
What a beautiful day.
It was a clear, frosty January day on which Mr. Tulliver first came downstairs. The bright sun on the chestnut boughs and the roofs opposite his window had made him impatiently declare that he would be more cheery under this sunshine than his bedroom, for he knew nothing of the bareness below. This resolution to come downstairs was heard with trembling by the wife and children. The hearts of all three had been more deeply dejected than ever during the last few days. For Guest & Co. had not bought the mill, and both mill and land had been knocked down to Wakeham, who had been over the premises and had spoken of his willingness to employ Mr. Tulliver, in case of his recovery, as a manager of the business.
You've been ill a great many weeks, more than 2 months. Everything has changed.
Mr. Tulliver's face looked pale and tremulous. Tom said nothing, and his father remained quiet, but his mind did not seem to be wandering away, and so he listened as he was told that everything was sold.
Let us go. Help me down, Luke. I'll go see everything.
Yes, Mr. Tulliver.
Mr. Tulliver paused just inside the door, resting on Luke, and looked round at all the bare places which for him were filled with shadows of departed objects, the daily companions of his life.
They've sold me up. They've sold me up.
Mrs. Tulliver entered the parlour to find her husband already seated in his chair.
Come downstairs.
Poor Bessie. You was a pretty lass. Everybody said so, and I used to think you kept your good looks rarely. But you're sorely aged. Don't bear me ill will. I meant to do well by you. We promised one another for better, for worse.
But I never thought it'd be so for worse as this.
If there's anything left as I could do to make you amends, I wouldn't say you nay.
Poor Mrs. Tulliver. There was a strange, scared look about her of late, and though Tom begged her not to continue, she told her husband that Wakeham now owned the mill and all the land, and he must agree to working for Wakeham, or where would they go? Mr. Tulliver sank back in his chair, trembling.
You may do what you like with me, Bessie. I'm naught but a bankrupt.
I don't think you ought to submit to be under Wakeham, Father. I get £1 a week now, and you can find something else when you get well.
Say no more, Tom. I've had enough for this day.
That first moment of submission was followed by days of violent struggle in the miller's mind. He saw a possibility by much pinching and saving money out of his salary towards paying back a second dividend to his creditors, and it would not be easy to get a situation such as he could fill. Now his wife must take help from her sisters, a prospect doubly bitter to him, as they'd let all Bessie's precious things be sold.
It's just as if it was yesterday. The old mill had missed me, I think, Luke. There's a story as when the mill changes hands, the river's angry. I've heard my father say it many a time.
Aye, sir. You'd be a deal better here nor in some new place.
That evening, Maggie noticed that her father was unusually absent at tea, and afterwards he sat leaning forward in his chair, looking at the ground, moving his lips and shaking his head from time to time.
I don't think you're quite so well tonight, are you, Father?
Why, how is it Tom doesn't come?
There was a strange light in his eyes that rather frightened Maggie, and she began to wish that Tom would come too. At last the knock at the door came, and Tom entered with his usual saddened evening face.
Come. You're late. I want you. Bring the Bible and the inkstand.
Is there anything the matter, Father?
Tom, you sit down here. I've got something for you to write in the Bible. Made up my mind, Bessie, and I'll be good as my word to you. There's the same grave made for us to lie down in.
Oh.
And we mustn't be bearing one another ill will. I'll stop in the old place, and I'll serve under Wakeham, and I'll serve him like an honest man. Though I shall never hold my head up no more. I'm a tree as is broke. A tree as is broke. But I won't ever forgive him. And you mind this, Tom. You never forgive him, neither, if you mean to be my son. There may be a time when you may make him feel. He'll never come to me. I got my head under a yoke. Now write it in the Bible.
Oh, Father, what? It is wicked to curse and bear malice.
It isn't wicked, I tell you. It's wicked as a rascal should prosper. It's the devil's doing. Do as I tell you, Tom. Write. You write as your father, Edward Tulliver, took service under John Wakeham, the man as had helped ruin him because I promised my wife to make her what amends for her I could. For her trouble. And I wanted to die in the old place where I was born. And my father was born. Put that in the right words. And then, write as I don't forgive Wakeham. And I wish evil may befall him. Now, write. You'll remember what Wakeham done to your father. And you'll make him and his feel it if ever the day comes. And sign your name, Thomas Tulliver.
No, dear father, you shouldn't make Tom write that.
Be quiet, Maggie. I shall write it.
And so the months went on. Mr. Tulliver was able to attend to business again. His affairs were settled, and he was acting as Wakeham's manager on the old spot. When Maggie laid down her work at night, it was her habit to get a low stool and sit by her father's knee, leaning her cheek against it. How she wished he would stroke her head, or give her some sign that he was soothed by the sense that he had a daughter who loved him. One afternoon, when the chestnuts were coming into flower, Maggie was roused by the sound of the opening of the gate and footsteps on the gravel. It was Bob Jakins, Tom's childhood friend, followed closely by a bull terrier.
Good afternoon, Miss Tulliver.
Oh, Bob, it's you. I'm so glad to see you. My brother is not at home yet.
You won't think I'm a making too free, miss, I hope, but I lighted on these books and this keepsake, and I thought they might make up to you a bit for them as you've lost.
You bought them for me, Bob. How very, very good of you, but I'm afraid you gave a great deal of money for them.
Not me. Had to give 3 times the money if they'll make up to you a bit for them as was sewed away from you, miss.
I'm very thankful to you for thinking of me and being so good to me and Tom. I don't think anyone ever did such a kind thing for me before.
Later that evening, hanging diligently over her sewing, Maggie was the sight anyone might have been pleased to look at. Her mother felt the change in her with a sort of puzzled wonder that Maggie should be growing up so good, and that it was amazing that this once contrary child was becoming so submissive. Mr. Tulliver, however, always knew that she would grow into a fine young lady.
It's nothing new to me. But it's a pity she isn't made of commoner stuff. She'll be thrown away, I doubt. There'll be nobody to marry her as is fit for her.
Maggie's graces of mind and body fed Mr. Tulliver's gloom. He sat patiently enough while she read him a chapter, or said something timidly when they were alone together about trouble being turned into a blessing. He took it all as part of his daughter's goodness, which made his misfortunes the sadder to him because they damaged her chance in life. In a mind charged with an eager purpose and an unsatisfied vindictiveness, there is no room for new feelings. Mr. Tulliver did not want spiritual consolation. He wanted to shake off the degradation of debt and to have his revenge. Four years have passed, and it was far on in June now. Maggie was on one of her frequent walks to a spot that lay beyond what was called the hill, an insignificant rise of ground, crowned by trees, lying along the side of the road which ran by the gates of Dulcott Mill. She followed the path to the hollows and mounds of an exhausted stone quarry. In her childish days, Maggie held this place, called the Red Deeps, in very great awe, and needed all her confidence in Tom's bravery to reconcile her to an excursion thither, visions of robbers and fierce animals haunting every hollow. Maggie enters the deeps by a narrow path through a group of Scotch firs. Looking at the old trees, she became conscious of a moving shadow cast by the evening sun on the grassy path. Philip Wakeham was standing before her. He first raised his hat, and then, blushing deeply, came forward and put out his hand to her. Maggie blushed too, with surprise, which soon gave way to pleasure, and she put out her hand to meet his.
You startled me. I never meet anyone here. Did you come to meet me?
Yes, I did. I wish to see you very much. I hope you will not be displeased with me.
No. I'm very glad you came, for I've wished very much to have an opportunity of speaking to you. I've never forgotten how good you were long ago to Tom, and me too. But I was not sure that you would remember us so.
I can't believe that you have thought of me as I have thought of you. Do you know, when I was abroad, I made a picture of you, as you looked that morning in the study when you said you would not forget me.
It was a watercolour sketch, of real merit as a portrait.
Oh dear, what a strange little girl I was. I remember myself with my hair in that way, in that pink frock. I really was like a gypsy. I dare say I am now. Am I like what you expected me to be?
No, Maggie. You are very much more beautiful than I thought you would be.
They passed from the fir trees and had now come to a green hollow, almost surrounded by an amphitheatre of the pale pink dog roses.
I wish we could have been friends. I mean, if it would have been good and right for us. But that is the trial I have to bear. I must part with everything I cared for when I was a child. And I must part with you, and we must never take any notice of each other again.
I know what there is to keep us apart on both sides, but it is not right, Maggie. It is not right to sacrifice everything to other people's unreasonable feelings. Perhaps you would let me see you here sometimes. Walk with you here?
I should like to see you again.
It seemed to her inclination that to see Philip now and then and keep up the bond of friendship with him was something not only innocent but good. Perhaps she might help him find contentment.
Tell me, have you many books? You were so fond of them when you were a little girl. Perhaps you would like to take this home with you. Do keep it, Maggie.
No, thank you. For I fear it would make me long for a full life. Oh dear, the sun is set. I am too long away. Goodbye, Philip.
Goodbye, Maggie.
While Maggie's life struggles had lain almost entirely within her own soul, one shadowy arm fighting another, and the slain shadows forever rising again, Tom was engaged in a dustier, noisier warfare, grappling with more substantial obstacles and gaining more definite conquests. Already in the second year at Guest & Co., Tom's salary was raised, but all except the price of his dinner and clothes went home into the tin box, and he shunned comradeship, lest it should lead him into expenses in spite of himself. Maggie had an awe of him, against which she struggled, as something unfair to her consciousness of wider thoughts and deeper motives. But it was no use to struggle. Tom, meanwhile, had shown no disposition to rely on anyone but himself.
Let us go and see my Uncle Glegg about this business scheme of yours, Bob. I'm sure he'll loan of me the money.
I hope so. You've got the chance of making a bit of money with...
Tom's old friend, Bob Jakin, had offered him a way of making a little money by trading a bit on his own account, if he could purchase a small cargo with savings. And when Mr. Tulliver was reluctant to part with his money, Tom, who was unwilling to abandon such a money-making scheme altogether, asked his Uncle Glegg if he would venture £20 on condition of receiving 5% of the profits. On the same evening of Maggie and Philip's first meeting, Tom was riding into Laceham, proud of being on his first journey on behalf of Guest & Co., and revolving in his mind all the chances that by the end of another year he should have doubled his gains, lifted off the obloquy of debt from his father's name, and perhaps, for he should be 21, have got a new start for himself on a higher platform of employment. Did he not deserve it? He was quite sure that he did. It is the following April, early afternoon, and the edge of sharpness in the spring air makes Maggie draw her large shawl close about her. There is a more eager, inquiring look in her eyes than there was last June, and a smile is hovering about her lips. She had been meeting Philip in secret for almost a year now. They would walk together in the Red Deeps and discuss the books that he would bring for her each time they met. That afternoon, spurred on by their conversation, Philip tentatively asked her if she thought she might be able to love a man who other women could not. A man like him, perhaps.
Maggie, I was a fool to say it. Forget that I've ever said it.
I am so surprised, Philip. I had never thought of you being my lover. It seemed so far off, like a dream. Only like one of those stories one imagines, that I should ever have a lover.
Then, do you love me?
I think I could hardly love anyone better. But it would be better for us not to say any more about it. You know, we couldn't even be friends if our friendship were discovered.
Look at me, Maggie. Tell me again, is it possible for you to love me? Come, Maggie, say one kind word. You don't seem happy enough. You are forcing yourself to say you love me out of pity.
No, Philip. I'm telling you the truth. It is all so new and strange to me, but I don't think I could love anyone better than I love you. But what would your own father say, Philip? Oh, it is quite impossible we can ever be more than friends. Brother and sister in secret, as we have been.
Maggie, I can't give you up. Unless you really only care for me as if I were your brother. Tell me the truth.
Your mind is a sort of world to me. You can tell me all I want to know. I should think I could never be tired of being with you.
Then my life will be filled with hope.
Maggie smiled at Philip, and with glistening tears, she stooped her tall head to kiss the low, pale face that was full of pleading, timid love. She had a moment of real happiness then, a moment of belief that if there were sacrifice in this love, it was all the richer and more satisfying. She hurried home, feeling that a new era had begun for her. At tea time that day, there was a peculiar brightness in Maggie's face, due in reality to an undercurrent of excitement, which had as much doubt and pain as pleasure in it, that it might pass for a sign of happiness.
Your girl would be so good-looking, Bessie.
Mrs. Pullet had come to take tea with poor Sister Tulliver, and they were all sitting together round the tea table in the Tullivers' parlour. Mrs. Pullet worried for Maggie, though, commenting that she ought to wear pink rather than blue. Maggie listened patiently and quietly to her aunt, but then the unexpected mention of Philip Wakeham, whom her aunt and uncle had seen twice, scrambling out of the trees and brambles at the Red Deeps, produced an effect on Maggie all the stronger because Tom sat opposite her, and she was intensely anxious to look indifferent. She blushed deeply and felt as if her whole secret were betrayed, and she dared not even hold her teaspoon, lest she should show how she trembled. Gradually, Maggie recovered composure enough to look up. Her eyes met Tom's, but he turned his head immediately, and she went to bed that night wondering if he had gathered any suspicion. Tom had seen clearly her excessive confusion at the mention of Philip Wakeham, and he tried to recall all the details that could give shape to his suspicions. He remembered only lately hearing his mother scold Maggie for walking in the Red Deeps when the ground was wet and bringing home shoes clogged with red soil.
Tom, how is it you have come home? Is anything the matter?
Tom had come home early the next day, at the swiftest pace.
I've come to walk with you to the Red Deeps and meet Philip Wakeham.
Maggie stood helpless, pale and cold. By some means, then, Tom knew everything. She turned away from him.
I'm not going.
Oh, yes, you are, but I want to speak to you first. Now, Maggie, tell me everything that has passed between you and Philip Wakeham.
Does my father know?
No, but he shall know if you attempt to use deceit towards me any further. Tell me the whole truth.
We have been friends for a year. We have met and walked together often. He has lent me books. One Saturday he told me that he loved me. I didn't think of it before then. I had only thought of him as a friend.
There are but two courses for you to take. Either you vow solemnly to me with your hand on my father's Bible that you will never meet with Philip Wakeham, or you refuse and I tell my father everything.
Please, Tom.
I can't trust you, Maggie. There is no consistency in you, while I have been contriving and working that my father may have some peace of mind before he dies. Working for the respectability of our family. You have done all you can to destroy it.
It was wrong of me, but I was so lonely. And I was sorry for Philip, and I think enmity and hatred are wicked.
Nonsense. Your duty was clear enough.
I must speak to Philip once more.
You will go with me now and speak to him.
I renounce all private speech.
And before they went, Maggie laid her hand on the page of the manuscript and made the promise.
Do you call this acting the part of a man and a gentleman, sir?
What do you mean?
I mean taking advantage of a young girl's foolishness and ignorance to get her to have secret meetings with you. I mean daring to trifle with the respectability of a family that has a good and honest name to support.
I deny that. I could never trifle with anything that has affected your sister's happiness. She is dearer to me than she is to you. I honor her more than you can ever honor her. I would give up my life to her.
Oh, don't talk high-flown nonsense to me, sir. Do you mean to pretend that you did not know it would be injurious to her to meet you here week after week? Do you pretend you had any right to make professions of love to her, even if you had been a fit husband for her, when neither her father nor your father would ever consent to a marriage between you? And you try and worm yourself into the affections of a handsome young girl who is not yet 18 and has been shut out from the world by her father's misfortunes. That's your crooked notion of honour, is it? I call it base treachery. I call it taking advantage of circumstances to win what's too good for you.
Tom, I will not bear it. I will listen no longer.
Stay, Maggie. You have dragged your sister here that she may stand by while you threaten and insult me. I only wished for her to have a friend for life who would cherish her, who would do her more justice than a coarse and narrow-minded brother that she has always lavished her affections on.
I'll save her from disobeying and disgracing her father. I'll save her from throwing herself away on you, from making herself a laughingstock, from being flouted by a man like your father because she's not good enough for his son. Come away, Maggie.
Tom seized Maggie's right wrist as he spoke, and she put out her left hand.
I'm sorry, Philip.
Philip clasped it an instant with one eager look and then hurried away. Once in her room, Maggie's bitter tears poured from her. Her heart bled for Philip and the insults that had been flung on him, that it was almost like a sharp bodily pain to her. And yet now and then she was conscious of a certain dim background of relief in the forced separation from Philip. And surely it was because the sense of deliverance from concealment was welcome at any cost. Three weeks later,
thanks,
when
Matilda.
Dorcott Mill was at its prettiest,
was that nerve-wracking? I
the
couldn't
great
wait. It was all very
chestnuts in
exciting in
blossom
here.
and the grass all deep and daisied, Tom arrived home earlier than usual. As he passed over the bridge, he looked with old, deep-rooted affection at the respectable house, which always seemed cheerful and inviting outside. Let the rooms be as bare and the hearts as sad as they might inside.
Good evening, Mother. Hello, Father.
Hardly a word or look had passed between him and Maggie in all the 3 weeks. After they'd finished tea, Tom took great pleasure in telling his father that he will live to see all the debts paid.
Oh, my boy, I knew you'd make everything right again. We got a man.
Oh, I wish you brought me the money to look at, Tom. I should have felt surer.
You shall see it tomorrow, Father. Uncle Dean has appointed the creditors to meet at the Golden Lion, and he has ordered a dinner for them at 2 o'clock. He advertised the meeting in the Messenger.
Then Wakem will know of this meeting.
The next day, when Mr. Tulliver was seated at the table with his creditors, he looked more like the proud, confident, warm-hearted and warm-tempered Tulliver of old times. He made his speech, alluding to the rascals and the luck that had been against him, and wound up with the story of how Tom had got the best part of the needful money. The party broke up in a very sober fashion at 5 o'clock. Tom remained in St. Ogg's to attend to some business, and Mr. Tulliver mounted his horse to go home. As he approached the yard gates of Dorcott Mill, he saw a well-known figure coming out of them on a fine black horse.
Tulliver! What a fool's trick you did!
spreading those hard lumps on that far close. I told you how it would be, but you men never learn to farm with any method.
Whoa there! Get somebody else to farm for you then, as I'll ask you to teach them up.
You've been drinking, I suppose.
No, I've not been drinking. I want no drinking to help me make up my mind, as I'll serve no longer under a scoundrel.
Very well. You may leave my premises tomorrow then. Hold your insolent tongue and let me pass.
No, I shan't let you pass. I shall tell you what I think of you first. You're too big a rascal to get hanged.
Let me pass, you ignorant brute, or I'll ride over you.
Mr. Tulliver, spurring his horse and raising his whip, made a rush forward, and Wakem's horse, rearing and staggering backward, threw his ride from the saddle, and before he could rise, Tulliver was off his horse too. He rushed on at Wakem and flogged him fiercely across the back with his riding whip.
Help me!
You'll suffer for this. Your daughter is witness that you've assaulted me.
Stop now! Stop.
I don't care. I don't care. Go and show him your back and tell him as I thrashed you. Tell him I've made things a bit more even in the world. Oh.
Father, come in. Come in now.
Come away now.
I feel ill. Faintish. Oh, help me in, Bessie. I'm giddy. I've a pain in the head.
The next morning, Mr. Tulliver had called for his family. Tom moved closer to his father, who struggled to speak.
Tom, my lad, it's come upon me. I shan't get up again. This world's been too many for me, my lad, but you've done what you could to make things a bit even. You try and get the old mill back. And there's your mother. You try and make amends for my bad luck. And you must take care of Maggie. Oh, don't fret, my little wench. There'll come somebody to love you, as'll love you and take your part. And you must be good to her, my lad. I was good to my sister.
Yes, Father.
Kiss me, Maggie. Come, Bessie. I had my turn. I beat him. That was nothing but fair. I never wanted anything but what was fair.
Father, you forgive him. You forgive everyone now.
No, my wench. I don't forgive him. What's forgiven to do? I can't love a rascal.
He wanted to say more, and he moved his lips again and again, struggling in vain to speak. For an hour or more the chest heaved, the loud, hard breathing continued, getting gradually slower, till at last there was a total stillness, and poor Tulliver's lighted soul had forever ceased to be vexed with the painful riddle of this world. Nearly 2 years after the death of Mr. Tulliver, his niece, Lucy Dean, was looking forward to a visit from her dear cousin, Maggie. Seated beside Lucy was Stephen Guest, a striking young man of 25, whose diamond ring, attar of roses, and air of nonchalant leisure at 12 o'clock in the day were the graceful and odoriferous result of being son and heir to the largest oil mill and the most extensive wharf in St. Ogg's.
My scissors, please, if you can renounce the great pleasure of persecuting my poor dog. And no, you may not have them back. You have strained them already. Don't set Minnie off growling again. Now, sit up and behave properly, and I will tell you some news.
Oh, yes?
My cousin Maggie is going to leave her situation in a school where she has been nearly 2 years, poor thing, ever since her father's death. And she will stay with me a month or two.
Oh, and you will be inseparable, I suppose, when she comes. There will be no possibility of a tete-a-tete with you anymore. And unless you can find an admirer for her who will
pair off with her occasionally. What about Philip?
Well, I have never found out whether my cousin Maggie will object to see Philip as her brother does.
What is the ground of dislike to Philip?
It was a family quarrel with Philip's father. But Tom and Maggie must naturally feel it very painful to be reminded of these things. They have had so very much trouble.
Once Maggie had arrived the next day and was settled, Lucy talked to her of Stephen.
He is very clever, Maggie. I feel sure you will like him. Well, I hope you will.
I shall be very difficult to please. A gentleman who thinks he's good enough for Lucy must expect to be sharply criticised.
Now, I know how much pleasure music gives you, but St Ogg's is miserably provided with musical gentlemen.
Oh.
There are really only Stephen and Philip who have any knowledge of music. Does it hurt you to hear the name mentioned, Maggie? I know Tom will not see him if he can avoid it.
I don't feel at all as Tom does on that subject. I've always liked Philip.
Oh, I'm so glad. Ah, that must be Stephen. One of the things I most admire in Stephen is that he makes a greater friend of Philip than anyone.
But Lucy, there is something...
It was too late for Maggie to speak now.
Let me introduce my cousin, Miss Tulliver. This is Mr. Stephen Guest.
Stephen could not conceal his astonishment at the sight of this tall, dark-eyed nymph with her jet-black coronet of hair.
I want Maggie to have delicious, do-nothing days, filled with boating and chatting and riding and music. That is the holiday she needs.
Well, apropos, shall we go out for a row on the river now? The tide will suit for us to go the Tofton way, and we can walk back.
This was a delightful proposition to Maggie, for it was years since she'd been on the river.
May I take an oar?
Yes, of course, Miss Tulliver. Into the water, glide, and out. Perfect.
It appeared that she required much teaching, and she became ambitious. The exercise brought the warm blood into her cheeks and made her inclined to take her lesson merrily.
I shall not be satisfied until I can use both oars and row you and Lucy.
Maggie was looking very bright as she stepped out of the boat, but lost her footing and slipped.
Oh.
Happily, Mr. Stephen Guest held her hand and kept her up with a firm grasp.
Thank you.
You've not hurt yourself at all, I hope?
It was very charming to be taken care of in that kind, graceful manner by someone taller and stronger than oneself. Stephen returned later that evening to join in with the music feast Lucy had planned. As Lucy played, Maggie was conscious of being looked at a great deal in a rather furtive manner from beneath a pair of well-marked horizontal eyebrows. When Maggie went up to her bedroom that night, her eyes and cheeks had a feverish brilliancy. The music was vibrating in her still when a little tap came at the door.
You really have enjoyed the music tonight, haven't you?
Oh, yes, I have.
We shall have more music tomorrow evening, for Stephen will bring Philip with him.
Oh, Lucy, I can't see him. At least I could not see him without Tom's leave.
Is Tom such a tyrant as that? May I speak to him about it?
Oh, no, pray, don't, dear. I'll go to him myself tomorrow and tell him you wish Philip to come.
Maggie, you have secrets from me, and I have none from you.
Maggie then told Lucy about her relationship with Philip, and Lucy's sweet little face bent towards her with sympathetic interest.
I never thought such a happiness would befall him. In my opinion, you ought not give him up. Oh, I shall puzzle my small brain to contrive some plot that will bring everybody into the right mind, so that you may marry Philip. Wouldn't that be a pretty ending to all my poor Maggie's troubles?
Maggie was obliged to go to Tom's lodgings at Bob Jakin's house in the middle of the day when he would be coming home to dinner. Sad recollections crowded on Maggie as she entered the small parlour, which was now all that poor Tom had to call by the name of home.
Good day, Maggie. Are you well? What brings you here?
Tom, I want you to absolve me from my promise about Philip Wakeham. Oh. Not for myself, dear Tom. Don't be angry. I shouldn't have asked it. Only Philip, as you know, is a friend of Lucy's, and she wishes him to come, and I said I couldn't see him without telling you.
You know what is my feeling on that subject, Maggie. But now I must leave you to your own choice. If you think of Philip Wakeham as a lover again, You must give me up.
I don't wish it, dear Tom. But I shall soon go away to another situation, and I should like to be friends with him again while I'm here. And Lucy wishes it.
Maggie thought this mention of Lucy might be the key to Tom changing his mind about her seeing Philip. She was sure that Tom was in love with Lucy.
I shouldn't mind you seeing him occasionally at my uncle's. But I have no confidence in you, Maggie. You would be led away to do anything.
Why would you say that, Tom? It is very hard of you. And have I not kept my word to you when my life has not been a happy one any more than yours?
I should like my sister to be a lady, and I would have always taken care of you as my father desired, until you were well married.
Yes, I know, dear Tom. I know you would do a great deal for me. I know how you work and don't spare yourself, and I am grateful to you. But our natures are different. You don't know how differently things affect me from what they do you.
I know how differently you must feel about all that affects our family and your own dignity as a young woman before you could think of receiving secret addresses from Philip Wakeham. With anyone but you, I should think it quite certain that what you witnessed just before my father's death would secure you from ever thinking again of Philip Wakeham as a lover.
I have given up thinking of Philip as a lover. I am telling you the truth, and you have no right to disbelieve me. I have kept my word to you.
I think all things considered, it will be best for you to see Philip Wakeham if Lucy wishes him to come to the house. I believe what you say. At least, you believe it yourself, I know. I can only warn you. I wish to be as good a brother to you as you will let me.
Dear Tom, I should like to comfort you, not vex you. I may turn out better than you expect.
Launched into the higher society of St. Ogg's, Maggie was certainly at a new starting point in life. This new sense of leisure and unchecked enjoyment amidst the soft-breathing airs and garden scents of advancing spring, amidst the new abundance of music and lingering strolls in the sunshine and delicious dreaminess of gliding on the river could hardly be without an intoxicating effect on her after her years of privation. Maggie began to be less haunted by her sad memories and anticipations.
Why, Maggie, I think you're...
And Lucy was all the happier because Stephen's society seemed to have become much more interesting and amusing since Maggie had been there. And it more than once crossed her mind what a charming quartet they should have through life when Maggie married Philip. Maggie was seated alone in the drawing room after dinner. Lucy had arranged to spend the evening with Mrs. Ken, whose delicate state of health obliged her to resign her functions at the forthcoming bazaar into the hands of other ladies, including Lucy. Footsteps on the gravel made her look up, and she saw Stephen walking up the garden, as if he had come straight from the river.
You are surprised to see me again, Miss Tulliver. I ought to apologise for coming upon you by surprise, but I wanted to come into town, and I got our man to row me, so I thought I would bring these things from the Maid of Artios for your cousin.
Stephen only wished he dared look at Maggie, and that she would look at him, and let him have one long look into those deep, strange eyes of hers.
We shall have a new face tomorrow night. Will you tell your cousin that Philip has come back?
Maggie gave a little start. The new images summoned by Philip's name dispersed the oppressive spell she had been under. She rose from her chair with sudden resolution and went to reach for Lucy's large work basket. She sat herself at the table, looking chill and proud. Stephen was vexed and disappointed. It was of no use to stay any longer. He rose to leave and thrust both hands into his tail pockets. Maggie thought perhaps she had been rude.
Won't you stay?
No, thank you. The boat is waiting for me. You'll tell your cousin that I bought the music, and that Philip is back.
I will.
Won't you come a little way into the garden?
Stephen offered Maggie his arm, and they walked together round the grass plot and under the laburnums, in the same dreamy state as they had been in inside the house. Only now Stephen had got the look he longed for. Not a word was spoken between them, until Stephen said at last.
Take care of the step.
Maggie, feeling like that step had come like a rescue, bid Stephen good evening and ran back into the house. Safely inside, Maggie threw herself into the low armchair in the drawing room and burst into tears.
Philip. Philip. Oh, I wish we were together again. So quietly in the red deeps.
Stephen spent the evening in the billiard room, smoking cigar after cigar and losing lives at pool. But he would not leave off. He was determined not to think, not to admit any more perpetual remembrance of Maggie. It was all madness. He was in love, thoroughly attached to Lucy, and he wished he'd never seen this Maggie Tulliver, to be thrown into a fever by her this way. He ought not to have gone. He would master himself in future. He would make himself disagreeable to her, quarrel with her. Quarrel with her? Was it possible to quarrel with a creature who had such eyes? The next morning was very wet.
Stephen will come earlier this morning. I know. He always does when it rains.
Maggie made no answer. She was angry with Stephen. She began to think she should dislike him. But it was another visitor who preceded Stephen. Philip Wakeham had spent many hours in preparation for this meeting, and Maggie felt her eyes getting larger with tears as they took each other's hands in silence. The scene was just what Lucy expected, and her kind heart delighted in bringing Philip and Maggie together again.
Excuse me for a moment, please.
Maggie and Philip leaned forward, and their hands were clasped again.
I told my brother I wished to see you, Philip. I asked him to release me from my promise, and he consented.
Then we can at least be friends, Maggie.
Will your father not object?
I should not give you up on any ground but your own wish, Maggie.
Then there is nothing to hinder our being friends again. Though I shall soon go away again. I mean to go very soon to a new situation.
Is that inevitable?
Yes. I must not stay here long. I can't live in dependence. I can't live with my brother, though he is very good to me. He would like to provide for me, but that would be intolerable for me.
Is there no other alternative, Maggie? Is that life away from those who love you the only one that you will allow yourself to look forward to?
Yes, Philip.
Well, old fellow. It's glorious to have you back again. Are you quite well this morning, Miss Tulliver?
Quite well, thank you.
How was the sketching then?
Stephen and Maggie had no sooner completed this greeting than each felt hurt by the other's coldness. And Stephen, while rattling on in questions to Philip about his recent sketching expedition, was thinking all the more about Maggie, because he was not drawing her into the conversation, as he had invariably done before. Lucy thought that neither Maggie nor Philip were looking happy, and was concerned that this first interview had been saddening for them.
I think we're all a little dampened by the rain. Let us have some music.
Philip brightened at the proposition and seated himself at the piano. For there was no feeling, perhaps, except the extremes of fear and grief that does not find relief in music. Philip had an abundance of pent-up feeling at this moment. Maggie always tried in vain to go on with her work when music began, but it was of no use. She soon threw her work down, and all her intentions were lost in the vague state of emotion produced by the inspiring music. Poor Maggie, she looked very beautiful when her soul was being played on in this way.
What is that you're falling into? Something delicious, I don't know.
It's from La Sonnambula. I don't know the opera well, but the tenor is telling the heroine that he shall always love her, though she may forsake him.
It was not quite unintentionally that Philip had wandered into this song, which might be an indirect expression to Maggie of what he could not prevail on himself to say to her directly. Her ears had been opened to what he was saying, and she understood the plaintive passion of the music. She was touched, not thrilled, by the song. It suggested distinct memories and thoughts and brought quiet regret in the place of excitement.
Try this. Something to liven
Stephen then rolled out new music and brought the room alive with a new, saucy energy, and Lucy, always proud of what Stephen did, went towards the piano with laughing, admiring looks at him. Angrily, Maggie was resolved not to betray herself, and she seized her work and went on making false stitches and pricking her fingers with much perseverance. There may have been a subtle, stealing gratification in Maggie's mind, if she had known how entirely this saucy, defiant Stephen was occupied with her, how he was passing rapidly from determination to treat her with ostentatious indifference to an irritating desire for some sign of inclination from her, some interchange of subdued word or look with her. It seemed to poor Philip so natural, nay, inevitable, that any man who was near Maggie should fall in love with her. 3 days later, Lucy contrived a private interview with Philip to tell him of her father's wish to buy Dorlcote Mill from Wakeham, and that it was her uncle Tulliver's dying wish for Tom to get the mill back so that the Tullivers may live there once more. For a day and a night, Philip turned over in his mind, with restless agitation, all that Lucy had told him, till he had thoroughly resolved on a course of action. Philip invited his father to his room to look over his new sketches, and he hoped broach the subject of ownership of Dorlcote Mill. Wakeham looked over his son's work until he came to a stand on which 2 pictures were placed.
Bless me. What have you here? I thought you'd left off figures for the landscapes. Who are these?
They are of the same person at different ages.
Wakeham fixed his eyes sharply with growing suspicion on the larger picture. He recognised his old enemy Tulliver in the face, and Philip told his father of his friendship with Maggie and how he had met her regularly before her father's death, and that he was in love with her.
I love her dearly. I shall never love any other woman.
Her father was an ignorant, mad brute who was within an inch of murdering me. The whole town knows it, and the brother is just as insolent. You'll break every bone in your body if you don't watch out.
Later that night, after Philip had refused to dine with his father and locked himself in his room for many hours, Wakeham returned to his son's room with more of an open and gentle mind.
This girl seems to have been fond of you, else she wouldn't have met you in that way.
Wakeham had taken the evening to reflect on his son's wishes and returned with a gentler frame of mind. Although he was wary of Maggie's unmanageable nature, he did want his son to have the happiness he had had with Philip's mother. Once the barrier was thrown down, Philip could talk freely of getting the Tulliver Mill and land back into the family, and with his father's consent. Philip went to Mr. Dean the next day to say that Mr. Wakeham was ready to open negotiations about the mill being transferred to Guest & Co. as an immediate first step. The culmination of Maggie's career as an admired member of St. Ogg's society was certainly the day of the bazaar. All the well-dressed of St. Ogg's were there at the fine old hall. As for dear Lucy, her late benevolent triumph about the mill and all the affectionate projects she was cherishing for Maggie and Philip helped to give her the highest spirits today, and Stephen was paying her the utmost attention.
Do go and buy something from Maggie.
No, see, she has got a customer. There's old Wakeham himself just coming up.
Lucy's eyes turned with anxious interest towards Maggie.
Hello, Mr. Wakeham.
My son came with me, but he has vanished into some other part of the building and has left all these charitable gallantries to me. I hope you'll reproach him for his shabby conduct.
Maggie returned his smile and bowed without speaking, and Wakeham turned away, only then observing Stephen and nodding at him.
Aren't you very tired? Do let me bring you something, some fruit or jelly.
No, thank you.
But you look so pale. I'm sure you're exhausted. I must disobey you and bring you something.
No, indeed, I couldn't take it.
Are you angry with me? What have I done? Oh, do look at me.
Pray, go away.
Maggie sat at her stall, cold and trembling, with that sensation in the eyes that comes from resolutely repressed tears. It was at this moment that Dr. Ken fixed his eyes on Maggie for the first time and was struck with the expression of pain on her beautiful face.
You find your office rather a fatiguing one, I fear, Miss Tulliver.
It is rather.
But I can tell Mrs. Ken that you've disposed of her goods very quickly. She'll be much obliged to you. And I hope I'm going to have you as a permanent parishioner now, Miss Tulliver. Am I?
I am going into another situation in a school very soon.
Oh, I understand. You feel it right to go. But that will not prevent our meeting again, I hope. It will not prevent my knowing you better, if I can be of any service to you.
Dr. Ken put out his hand and pressed hers kindly before he turned away. The suite of rooms at Park House, Stephen's home, looked duly brilliant with lights and flowers and the personal splendours of 16 couples with attendant parents and guardians, and Lucy was the acknowledged queen of the occasion. Maggie at first refused to dance, but at length the music wrought in her young limbs and the longing came.
It's rather dizzy work to look on, and the room is very warm. Shall we walk about a little?
How strange and unreal the flowers look with the lights upon them. They look as if they belong to an enchanted land.
Maggie was looking at the half-opened roses as she spoke, but Stephen was mute and incapable of putting a sentence together. But then a mad impulse seized on Stephen, and he took Maggie's arm and showered kisses upon it.
How dare you? What right have I given you to insult me?
I'm sorry, forgive me.
Leave me to myself, if you please, and for the future, avoid me.
With the thoughts and temptations of the last month flung away into an unvisited chamber of memory, there was nothing to elude Maggie now. Duty would be easy, and all the old calm purposes would reign peacefully once more. And one beautiful June morning, Maggie was setting off to visit her Aunt Moss, but was delayed by an unexpected but welcome visitor.
We can just catch the tips of the Scotch firs, Maggie, from here.
Yes, I often look at them, and I wish I could see the low sunlight on the stems again. But I have never been that way but once, to the churchyard with my mother.
I go there continually. I have nothing but the past to live upon. You will go there again soon, won't you, Maggie? The mill will soon be your brother's home again.
Yes, but I shall not be there. I shall only hear of that happiness.
Then the future will never join on to the past again? That book is quite closed?
That book will never be closed. But, Philip, I can do nothing willingly that will divide me from Tom. His tie is the strongest.
Is that the only reason that would keep us apart forever, Maggie?
The only reason.
And she believed her decision. At that moment, she felt as if the enchanted cup had been dashed to the ground, and she looked at the future with a sense of calm choice. Maggie had been 4 days at her Aunt Moss's, giving the early June sunshine quite a new brightness in the care-dimmed eyes of that affectionate woman. She was standing on the causeway with her aunt and a group of cousins, feeding the chickens, when her aunt noticed a gentleman on a tall bay horse, riding fast through the gate. Maggie saw him too, and felt a beating at head and heart.
Who is it, my dear?
It is Mr. Stephen Guest, my cousin Lucy's, a gentleman who is very intimate at my cousin's.
Hold the horse, Willie.
No, thank you. I must be going again immediately. I have a message to deliver to you, Miss Tulliver, on private business. May I take the liberty of asking you to walk a few yards with me?
He had a half-jaded, half-irritated look, such as a man gets when he's been dogged by some care or annoyance that makes his bed and his dinner of little use to him. Maggie, feeling all the embarrassment of the situation and unable to say anything, turned to walk towards the gate. Stephen walked by her side, leading his horse.
There is no need for me to go any further. I don't know whether you consider it gentlemanly and delicate conduct to place me in a position that forced me to come out with you, or whether you wish to insult me still further by thrusting an interview upon me in this way.
Of course you are angry with me for coming. Of course it is of no consequence what a man has to suffer. It is only your woman's dignity that is cared about. As if it were not enough that I am entangled in this way, that I am mad with love for you. I know. I forgot myself. I took an unwarrantable liberty. I hate myself for having done it. But I repented immediately. You must believe the worst pain I could have is to have pained you.
You must not say these things. I am very sorry for any pain you have got to go through, but it is of no use to speak of it.
Yes, it is of use. It would be of use if you would treat me with some sort of pity and consideration.
instead of doing me vile injustice in your mind.
I don't think any evil of you.
Then, dearest, look at me. Make me feel you've forgiven me.
Yes, I do forgive you. But pray let me go in again. Pray go away.
I can't go away from you. I can't leave you.
Think of Lucy.
I do think of her. Bless her.
And I have other ties, even if Lucy did not exist.
You're engaged to Philip. Is it so?
I consider myself engaged to him. I don't mean to marry anyone else.
Oh, it's unnatural. It's horrible. Maggie, if you loved me as I love you, we should throw everything else to the winds for the sake of belonging to each other.
I would rather die than fall into that temptation.
Well, tell me then that you love someone else better. If you do love me, dearest, it is better, it is right that we should marry each other. It has taken hold of me, in spite of every effort I have made to resist it.
Oh, I must not, cannot seek my own happiness by sacrificing others. Our love would be poisoned. Don't urge me. Help me. Help me, because I love you.
Dearest, I'll bear anything you wish. But one kiss, one, the last, before we part.
One kiss, and then a long look, until they hurried back, and not another word was spoken. Maggie went through the gate and saw her aunt standing alone at the door of the old porch. She had sent all the cousins in, with kind thoughtfulness. It might be a joyful thing that Maggie had a rich and handsome lover, but she would naturally feel embarrassed at coming in again, and might not be joyful. The poor thing's face said plainly enough that if there was joy, it was of a very agitating, dubious sort. Maggie threw her arms around her aunt's neck and fell into long, deep sobs. In less than a week, Maggie was at St. Ogg's again, and it was easy for her to fill her mornings, apart from Lucy, without any obvious effort. But Lucy was insistent that Maggie should always be present for dinner. Mr. Stephen, guest, had unaccountably taken to dining at Mr. Dean's as often as possible. Philip was a less frequent visitor, but he came occasionally in the evening.
Now that Maggie's tale of visits to Aunt Glegg is completed, I mean that we shall all go boating every day until she goes. She likes it better than anything. Don't you, Maggie? Stephen, doesn't rowing suit you now?
Oh, I hate a large party on a boat. I'll come back when you have no one else.
As Miss Dean didn't know she was excluding others by inviting me, I am bound to resign.
No, indeed, you shall not. It will be a delicious time for a couple of hours to row to Luckreth and walk back before the sun gets too hot. And how can you object to 4 people in a boat?
I don't object to the people, but the number. If I voted for a 4th at all, of course it would be you, Phil. But we won't divide the pleasure of escorting the ladies. We'll take it alternatively. I'll go the next day.
There had been moments over the past week in which a cruel selfishness seemed to be getting possession of Maggie. Why should not Lucy? Why should not Philip suffer? Maggie had suffered through many years of her life, and who had renounced anything for her? And was Stephen not suffering too? She saw it daily, saw it in his sickened look of fatigue. As soon as he was not compelled to exert himself, he relapsed into indifference towards everything but the possibility of watching her. And that evening was no exception. While Philip played, Stephen positioned himself on a chair with his back to the piano and looked at Maggie. Eventually she heard the words, "Dearest," uttered in the softest tone of pained entreaty. Philip could hear no word, but he could see Maggie start and blush, raise her eyes an instant towards Stephen's face, but immediately look apprehensively towards Philip. Philip went home soon after, in a state of hideous doubt, mingled with wretched certainty. Meanwhile, the next morning, Lucy had arranged a charming plan. She was going to Lindum with her father and Mrs. Tulliver to make important purchases, leaving Maggie and Philip to enjoy the boat alone. The ring at the doorbell was punctual, and Maggie was thinking with half-sad, affectionate pleasure of the surprise Philip would have in finding that he was to be with her alone. However, the firm, rapid step across the hall she heard was certainly not Philip's, and her heart began to beat violently.
Philip is not coming. I am going in the boat.
Oh, we can't go. Lucy has gone to Lindum.
Very well. Then we'll stay here.
The man is waiting. He has taken the cushions. Will you go and tell him?
What shall I tell him? Let us go. We shall not be long together.
And they went. They glided rapidly along to Stephen's rowing, helped by the backward flowing tide, past the trees and houses, on between the silent sunny fields and pastures which seemed filled with a natural joy that had no reproach for theirs. Some low, subdued, languid exclamation of love came from Stephen from time to time, as he went on rowing idly, half automatically. Otherwise they spoke not a word. At last Stephen laid down the oars, folded his arms and looked down at the water as if watching the pace at which the boat glided without his help. This sudden change roused Maggie. She looked at the far-stretching fields and felt that they were entirely strange to her.
Oh, have we passed Luckreth?
Yes, a long way.
What shall we do? We shall not be home for hours. And Lucy! Oh, God help me! Oh.
Maggie, let us never go home again. Till no one can part us, till we are married. See how the tide is carrying us out, away from all those unnatural bonds that we have been trying to make fast around us, and trying in vain. It will carry us to Torby, and we can land there and get some carriage and hurry on to York and then to Scotland.
You have wanted to deprive me of any choice. You knew we were come too far. You have dared to take advantage of my thoughtlessness. It is unmanly to bring me into such a position.
I didn't notice that we had passed Luckreth till we had got to the next village, and then it came into my mind that we would go on. I can't justify it. I ought to have told you.
He moved to her side and took her hand, leaning his elbow on the back of the boat, and said nothing. They glided along in this way, both resting in silence for some time, until Stephen saw a vessel coming after them.
Maggie, dearest, if this vessel should be going to Mudport or to any convenient place on the coast northward, it would be our best plan to get them to take us on board.
It was a Dutch vessel going to Mudport, and if this wind held, it would be there in less than 2 days. Maggie was helped on board and was by now faint and trembling with fear. There was a sense that no new resolution could be made today. Everything must wait until tomorrow. Stephen sat beside her, with her hand in his. Stephen was triumphantly happy. Every other thought or care was thrown into unmarked perspective by the certainty that Maggie must be his. They'd arrived at Mudport at 5 o'clock the following evening, and though Stephen became more and more uneasy as the day advanced, under the sense that Maggie had entirely lost her passiveness, he had, as soon as they had landed, given order for a chaise to take them onward in their journey together. He had longed, but did not dare to speak of their marriage, of where they would go after it, and the steps he would take to inform his father, and the rest of what had happened. But he was resolute now. She would not leave him. He would sooner die.
I'm not going. We must part here.
I can't part. I can't bear it. Maggie, dearest, if you love me, you are mine. Who can have so great a claim on you as I have? My life is bound up in your love. It is the first time we have either of us loved with our whole heart and soul.
No, not with my whole heart and soul, Stephen. I have never consented to it with my whole mind. If I could wake back again into the time before yesterday, I would choose to be true to my calmer affections and live without the joy of love.
Oh, good God, what a miserable thing a woman's love is to a man's. I could commit crimes for you, and you can balance and choose in that way. But you don't love me. If you had a tithe of the feeling for me that I have for you, it would be impossible for you to think for a moment of sacrificing me, but it weighs nothing with you that you are robbing me of my life's happiness. Go then. Leave me. I will not endure it.
Tom Tulliver stands on the gravel walk outside the old house at Dorlcote Mill. He is master there now. There was no news of his sister since Bob Jakin had come back from Mudport and put an end to all improbable suppositions of an accident on the water by stating that he'd seen her land from a vessel with Mr. Stephen Guest. As he was walking back towards the house, a tall, dark-eyed figure approached the gate.
Tom! I'm come back to you. I'm come back home for refuge to tell you everything.
You will find no home with me, Maggie. You have disgraced us all, and I wash my hands of you forever.
I am perhaps not so guilty as you believe me to be.
You've been carrying on a clandestine relation with Stephen Guest, as you did before with another.
Whatever I have done, I repent it bitterly. I want to make amends.
Go and see Lucy, the kindest friend you ever had. Lucy is so ill she is unable to speak.
I do want to keep from doing wrong again.
What will keep you, Maggie? You struggle with your feelings, you say. I have had feelings to struggle with, but I conquered them. I have had a harder life than you have had, but I have found my comfort in doing my duty. If you are in want, I will provide for you. Let my mother know. But you shall not come under my roof.
With despair in her heart, Maggie slowly turned away from her brother. Mrs. Tulliver, who had been standing at the door, called out to her daughter.
I'll go with you. Come in, my child. He'll let you stay and sleep in my bed if I ask him.
No, Mother, I'll never go in. Let us go to Bob Jakin's.
And so they went to the old house by the riverside.
Come in then, Mrs. Tulliver. Miss Tulliver.
And both the mother, Mrs. Jakin the larger, and the wife, Mrs. Jakin the less, were commanded to make all things comfortable for the old Mrs. and young Miss. The next day, Maggie was alone in the old sitting room that looked on the river, when there came a tap at the door.
We'll go back if it disturbs you, miss.
Oh, no. Come in, Bob.
You see, we've got a little one, miss, and I wanted you to look at it and take it in your arms, if you'd be so good. For we made free to name it after you.
Sit down, Bob. I have a favour to ask of you. I want you to go to Dr. Ken's and ask to speak to him and tell him that I am here and I should be very grateful if he would come to me.
Hey, miss, I'd do it in a minute. It is but a step. But Dr. Ken's wife lies dead. She's to be buried tomorrow. I should hardly like to go anigh him yet.
Oh, no. Bob, we must let it be.
It was soon known throughout St. Ogg's that Miss Tulliver was come back. She had not then eloped in order to be married to Mr. Stephen Guest. At all events, Mr. Stephen Guest had not married her, which came to the same thing as far as her culpability was concerned.
Father, I feel I must write...
It was a whole week before Stephen's letter came, telling his father the facts, and adding that he was gone across to Holland, having drawn money at Mudport, and was incapable of any resolution at present. Maggie, all this while, was too entirely filled with more agonising anxiety to spend any thought on the view that was being taken of her conduct by the world of St. Ogg's. Anxiety about Stephen, Lucy, Philip beat on her poor heart in her hard, driving, ceaseless storm of mingled love, remorse, and pity. Maggie had resolved on walking to the rectory and asking to see Dr. Ken. It was the first time she had been beyond the door since her return.
I was coming to see you, Miss Tulliver. You have anticipated me.
I made a mistake, and I repent.
And so in rather broken sentences, and with some effort at first, Maggie told the brief story of a struggle that must be the beginning of a long sorrow, and Dr. Ken listened and sat silent for some time.
I have read the letter. You may not realise it, but there is a great deal of concern about your conduct, in spite of the evidence that proves otherwise. I think it might be best for you to consider taking a situation away from St. Ogg's.
I have no heart to begin a strange life again. I could perhaps atone in some way to Lucy, to others. I could convince them that I'm sorry.
I am bound to aid you by the very duties of my office as a parish priest. I will exert myself at once.
When Maggie was home again, her mother brought her news of an unexpected line of conduct in Mrs. Glegg.
Glegg was severely disapproving of Tom's behaviour towards you.
When she learned from Tom that Maggie had come home and gathered from him what was her explanation of her absence, she burst forth in severe reproof of Tom for admitting the worst of his sister.
She said the kindest word has ever been spoke by you yet, my child. For she says you shall have shelter in her house, and she'll uphold you against folks as say harm of you when they've no call.
Tell her I'm very grateful. But did you hear nothing of Philip?
No, my dear, but I've been to Lucy's. Your uncle says they got her to listen to the letter, and the doctor thinks she's on the turn to be better.
Still, 2 or 3 more days passed, and Maggie heard nothing of Philip, until at last a letter arrived.
Maggie, I believe in you. I know you never meant to deceive me. I know you tried to keep faith to me and to all. I believed this before I had any other evidence of it than your own nature.
Than your own nature. The night after I last parted from you, I suffered torments. I had seen what convinced me that you were not free. That there was another whose presence had a power over you which mine never possessed. God comfort you, my loving, large-souled Maggie. If everyone else had misconceived you, remember that you have never been doubted by him whose heart recognized you 10 years ago. Yours.
Yours to the
last. Philip.
Philip.
Maggie knelt by the bed, sobbing, her feelings again and again gathering themselves in a whispered cry.
Oh, God, is there any happiness in love that could make me forget their pain?
Maggie.
Oh, Lucy. Oh, God bless you for coming, Lucy.
Oh, Maggie, dear, be comforted. Don't grieve.
I didn't mean to deceive you, Lucy.
I know, dear. I know you never meant to make me unhappy. It is a trouble that has come on us all. You have more to bear than I have, and you gave him up when... You did what it must have been very hard to do.
Lucy, he struggled too. He wanted to be true to you. He will come back to you. Forgive him. He will be happy then.
I'm to go away on Friday, but when I come back, I shall come to you when I please then.
Lucy, I pray to God continually that I may never be the cause of sorrow to you any more.
Maggie, you are better than I am. If I were in your place, I can't...
In the second week of September, Maggie was again sitting in her lonely room, battling with her old, shadowy enemies that were forever slain and rising again.
Maggie, I must advise you to go away from St. Ogg's for a time. I am sorry. I think it is best for you to follow this course at present.
Dr. Ken did not dwell on the new gossip and slander against Maggie's name, and the incorrect rumours that she had desires on becoming Dr. Ken's wife. It was past midnight, and the rain was beating down heavily against the window, driven with fitful force by the rushing, loud, moaning wind. Maggie was seated towards the river with one candle that left everything dim in the room, except a letter which lay before her on the table. The letter was from Stephen. He was in Mudport again.
Maggie, whose pain can have been like mine? Who besides me has met that long look of love that has burnt itself into my soul so that no other image can come there? 2 months have only deepened the certainty that I can never care for life without you. Write me one word. Say, come. In 2 days I should be with you. Maggie, have you forgotten what it was to be together? To be within reach of a look? To be within hearing of each other's voice?
No, she must not give in to the temptation. She took up the letter, held it to the candle, and let it burn slowly on the hearth.
Oh, forgive me, Stephen. It will pass away. You will come back to her.
Suddenly, Maggie felt water flowing under her. The stream was flowing under the door that led into the passage. Maggie hurried with the candle upstairs to Bob Jakin's bedroom.
Wake up!
She shook him by the shoulder.
Up. The flood has come. It's in the house. Let us see if we can make the boat safe.
Heavens, Maggie, wake up, Prissy. Get the baby. Wake your mother.
Maggie hurried down again and saw that the water was rising fast.
Mom! Come down and get the boat!
Without a shudder of fear, Maggie plunged through the water, which was rising fast to her knees. She mounted onto the windowsill and onto a boat.
The water's rising so fast. I thought mine to get Prissy and the child and the mother into the boat. But the old house is not to save.
Yes, Bob! Get them safe!
For you!
Maggie had no time to answer, for the new tidal current swept along the line of houses and drove both boats out onto the wide water. Maggie was driven out upon the flood. What was happening to them at the mill?
Where am I? Which way is home?
She seized an oar and began to paddle the boat forward with the energy of wakening hope.
I must get into the current of the Floss.
Maggie's heart began to beat with agony and dread as she imagined with more and more vividness the state of things around her old home. Colour was beginning to awaken now, and as she approached Dorlcote Fields, she could discern the tints of the trees. Maggie neared the front of the house. Her boat was level with the upstairs windows.
Tom! Where are you? Mother! I'm here! It's Maggie!
Maggie!
Yes! Where is Mother?
She's not here. She went to Garum. Are you alone, Maggie?
Yes! Get in, quickly!
They sat, mutely gazing at each other. Maggie with eyes of intense life looking out from a weary, beaten face, and Tom, pale, with a certain awe and humiliation.
We will go to Lucy. We'll go and see if she's safe, and then we can help the rest.
Tom took the oars from Maggie and rowed with untired vigour. The boat was soon in the current again, and nothing else was said. A new danger was being carried towards them by the river. Some wooden machinery had just given way in one of the wharfs, and huge fragments were being floated along. Tom, looking before him, saw death rushing on them. He dropped the oars and clasped Maggie.
It is coming, Maggie!
Tom!
The boat reappeared, but brother and sister had gone, down in an embrace never to be parted, living through again, in one supreme moment, the days when they had clasped their little hands in love and roamed the daisied fields together. Nature repairs her ravages, but not all. The uptorn trees are not rooted again. The parted hills are left scarred. If there is new growth, the trees are not the same as the old, and the hills underneath their green vesture bear the marks of the past rending. To the eyes that have dwelt on the past, there is no thorough repair. Dorlcote Mill was rebuilt, and Dorlcote Churchyard. There was a tomb erected very soon after the flood for two bodies that were found in close embrace. The tomb bore the names of Tom and Maggie Tulliver, and below the names it was written, "In their death, they were not divided."
I'm so sorry. Sleep well, dearest.
The tomb was visited often by two men,
my love,
who both felt that their keenest joy and keenest sorrow were forever buried there.
I will be waiting at the Red Deeps, Maggie. Look after her, Tom.
One of them visited the tomb again, with a sweet face beside him, but that was years after. The other was always solitary. His great companionship was among the trees of the Red Deeps, where the buried joy seemed still to hover, like a revisiting spirit.